June 6, 1944. 27,000 feet above the churning waters of the English Channel, the roar of C-47 transport planes filled the dawn sky. Below, the coast of Normandy stretched like a jagged scar, bristling with German fortifications and machine gun nests. Paratroopers gripped their gear, sweat mingling with the cold mist of early morning. In the cramped cockpit of a leading aircraft, Brigadier General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, peered at the horizon with a mix of calculation and anxiety, the gray light glinting off the buttons of his service coat. On the ground thousands of miles away, President Harry S. Truman, then Vice President, pored over encrypted cables at the White House. His eyes scanned dispatches from SHAF headquarters in London. He trusted Eisenhower implicitly, having championed the general's rise through the ranks, from the early staff positions under George Marshall to the historic appointment as Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe. Truman's belief in Eisenhower was more than professional. It was personal. He had offered the general the presidency, joking privately that the nation might survive him better than some politicians. Eisenhower, meanwhile, walked the narrow catwalk of the transport plane, adjusting the straps of his leather flight helmet. The scent of engine oil mixed with the metallic tang of ammunition crates. Every breath seemed weighted by the anticipation of history, the D-Day invasion that could decide the war's outcome. Radios crackled with coded messages, and Eisenhower's face, usually impassive, betrayed a flicker of tension as he glanced at the enlisted men, many of them barely out of training, clinging to the aircraft's interior with white-knuckled grips. Back in Washington, Truman's assistant, Charlie Ross, leaned over the desk, tapping a stack of incoming telegrams. "Mr. Vice President, Eisenhower's briefing just arrived. Normandy looks worse than expected," he said quietly. Truman's hand hovered over the envelope as he read the coded messages, imagining the general moving among the troops, speaking quietly, giving orders, calming fears. He had seen Eisenhower in action before, coordinating the North African campaign and planning Operation Torch. Now, the stakes had multiplied tenfold. The bond between Truman and Eisenhower had been cemented in these moments of crisis. Truman's admiration for the general's cool, methodical mind was the kind of loyalty that could shape careers. It had been Truman who lobbied for Eisenhower's elevation to five-star general, who recognized the political wisdom in supporting a man whose leadership could unite fractured Allied forces. And Eisenhower, ever mindful of the civilian oversight of military operations, had always respected Truman's judgment, valuing his clarity and decisiveness. But even in these moments of camaraderie, hints of the future rift lay in shadows. Eisenhower's reliance on public opinion, the careful diplomacy with his political backers, and Truman's instinctive bluntness created a tension neither acknowledged. For now, though, their focus was singular: victory. On the morning of D-Day, as paratroopers leapt into the unknown and naval bombardments thundered ashore, a silent understanding connected the battlefield and the White House. History was being written, and these two men, once allies in trust and ambition, were at the epicenter of its unfolding drama. The engine screamed as Eisenhower secured his maps, charting the drop zones over St. Miraglisse, unaware that years later, the friendship forged in these skies would fracture under the pressures of politics, ambition, and the shadows of McCarthyism. The first seeds of estrangement were planted here in the crucible of war, even if neither man could see them yet. November 12, 1945. The ornate, carpeted corridors of the Pentagon were quiet for once, a rare lull after the final German surrender months earlier. Eisenhower, now a five-star general, walked briskly toward his office, the echo of polished shoes on marble floors punctuating the weight of history he carried with each step. Maps and strategic charts lined the walls, testaments to campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, and the beaches of Normandy. He paused briefly, fingers brushing a photograph of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, a reminder of men lost and victories hard-earned. Across town, in the Truman family home in Independence, Missouri, Harry Truman read the morning papers with a solemn cup of coffee in hand. Headlines celebrated the end of the war and hinted at the rising tensions with the Soviet Union. Truman's mind, however, lingered on Eisenhower, not just as a general, but as a symbol of stability and integrity in an unpredictable post-war world. He remembered their discussions in Washington and London, the quiet evenings when plans for rebuilding Europe had been debated over maps and cigar smoke. Their friendship was more than respect. It was a bond forged in the crucible of global conflict. It was during these years that Truman publicly and privately championed Eisenhower. He saw the general as an ideal presidential candidate, one who could bridge military prowess with political moderation, appealing to both parties and the American people weary of war. In private letters, Truman's praise was effusive. He wrote of Eisenhower's unfailing judgment and steady character, suggesting that the nation could hardly find a leader more suited to the burdens of peace. The bond was so strong that rumors circulated in Washington corridors that Truman would personally encourage Eisenhower to enter politics, a notion that the general neither confirmed nor denied. But the war had left its own mark. Eisenhower, ever cautious, began to recognize the delicate balance between military service and political ambition. At a banquet honoring the liberation of Paris, he was approached by reporters probing his political future. He offered carefully measured smiles and noncommittal responses. Truman, on the other hand, with his blunt Midwestern straightforwardness, could not conceal his hope that Eisenhower would step onto the political stage. Their interactions were warm but tinged with an unspoken tension. Eisenhower understood the weight of expectation, while Truman viewed him as the natural heir to lead a nation at a crossroads. By 1948, the tension between personal loyalty and political reality became even more pronounced. Truman, now president after Roosevelt's passing, relied on Eisenhower for counsel on military and foreign policy. Yet, the general remained wary of overt political maneuvering. In letters exchanged between them, Eisenhower praised Truman's decisiveness, but warned that his own ambitions, or the ambitions others projected onto him, could disrupt the careful balance of governance. Truman, however, misread the subtle caution as hesitation, setting the stage for misunderstandings that would later fester into estrangement. Their public appearances, too, reflected a complex partnership. In ceremonies honoring veterans, both men spoke with reverence for sacrifice and unity. Yet behind the smiles and handshakes, observers sensed the careful choreography of two men aware of each other's influence, navigating the transition from wartime command to peacetime politics. It was a delicate dance. Truman's political instincts and Eisenhower's strategic caution intersected in ways that would soon collide with the rising heat of the Cold War and the domestic pressures of McCarthy-era America. And so, as the nation celebrated peace, the seeds of future discord were quietly being sown. A friendship forged in shared danger now faced the testing fire of ambition, loyalty, and the shifting currents of American politics. The bond that had seemed unbreakable in Normandy skies was now poised on the precipice of fracture, a fracture that would reveal itself in the years to come, beginning with a fateful speech in Wisconsin during the 1952 presidential campaign. September 8, 1952. The crisp autumn air in Madison, Wisconsin, carried the scent of damp leaves and gasoline from passing cars, a subtle backdrop to the tension building inside the University of Wisconsin's packed auditorium. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, now the Republican nominee for president, adjusted his cufflinks under the glare of stage lights, his face calm, but his eyes betraying a quiet unease. The hall buzzed with reporters, students, and political operatives, each eager to witness what promised to be a defining moment in Eisenhower's first campaign speech. Eisenhower had always been meticulous, rehearsing every line, weighing every phrase. But today, the specter of his mentor George C. Marshall loomed over the speechwriter's notes. Marshall, the architect of Allied victory and former Army Chief of Staff, had been the subject of subtle attacks by McCarthyites, who framed him as too sympathetic to internationalist policies and insufficiently vigilant against communist influence. Eisenhower, whose loyalty to Marshall was unshakable, insisted that the general's defense remain in the speech. Backstage, aides whispered urgently, "Sir, the political team insists you remove that paragraph about Marshall. They say it could cost votes in critical states," one aide murmured, glancing nervously at the cue cards. Eisenhower exhaled slowly, his hands tightening on the podium. The choice was stark: uphold loyalty to a revered friend and risk alienating voters, or bow to political expediency and compromise personal principles. Meanwhile, in Washington, President Truman read reports of the unfolding campaign with growing anxiety. His friendship with Eisenhower had survived war and post-war tensions, but the 1952 election was revealing cracks. Truman had long feared that Eisenhower's political advisers would sway the general away from the ethical compass that had guided him through the war. Now he watched as those fears were realized on the campaign trail. The man who once accepted Truman's personal endorsement was being pressured to silence a public defense of a friend and mentor. Inside the auditorium, Eisenhower paused mid-sentence, the words about Marshall hovering unspoken on his lips. Cameras clicked, recording the moment for posterity. For a fleeting heartbeat, the weight of loyalty versus ambition hung between him and the nation. The room seemed to sense it too, the tension palpable, almost electric. Eisenhower finally made a subtle adjustment, rephrasing the section without fully excising his defense, a compromise, but one that left a faint shadow of unease lingering over the campaign. It was in these small, seemingly incidental moments that the fissures began to form between Truman and Eisenhower. To Truman, the compromise signaled a drift away from the principles that had united them during the war. To Eisenhower, the pressures of a national campaign demanded pragmatism he had not exercised during the war. Political ambition and personal loyalty were colliding in a way neither man fully anticipated, foreshadowing a rupture that would only widen after the election. By the time Eisenhower delivered his acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention, the careful observer could already sense a transformation. The wartime camaraderie, the quiet consultations and mutual respect, had been overshadowed by the demands of public office and partisan politics. Truman, watching the broadcast from the Oval Office, felt an unease he could not articulate. The man he had once considered a friend and potential successor now navigated a world in which loyalty and principle were subordinate to electoral calculation. As autumn deepened over the Midwest, the battlefields of Europe faded into memory, replaced by the domestic arenas of politics. And in this new theater, loyalty, once the glue of friendship, would become a fragile, contested commodity. Eisenhower's compromises in Wisconsin, though small, would echo in the months to come, shaping a feud that would stretch from Inauguration Day to Kennedy's funeral years later. January 20th, 1953. The crisp winter air of Washington, D.C. stung the cheeks of the assembled crowd at the Capitol steps, where tens of thousands of citizens had gathered to witness the peaceful transfer of power. Snowflakes drifted lazily across the marble facade, glinting in the mid-morning sunlight, while bands played and flags snapped in the wind. Inside the White House, however, a storm of a different kind was brewing. President-elect Dwight D. Eisenhower, immaculately dressed in a dark overcoat and top hat, stood beside his aides on the inaugural reviewing stand. Cameras clicked relentlessly, capturing every detail for newspapers and newsreels across the nation. Behind him, ushers moved quietly, anticipating the arrival of the outgoing president. Moments later, Harry Truman appeared, wrapped in his signature overcoat, his face taut with formality, yet shadowed by lingering disappointment. The two men had not met privately since the Wisconsin incident months earlier. For Truman, watching Eisenhower navigate the political minefield of the campaign, compromising on principles, yielding to advisers, appearing to sideline past loyalties, felt like a betrayal. Eisenhower, for his part, understood the public expectation that had forced his hand, but he also knew that the personal cost of compromise was now impossible to ignore. As the ceremony concluded and aides began moving Truman toward the presidential limousine, Eisenhower pulled him aside in the private hallway behind the Senate chamber. The space was narrow, echoing with the muted sounds of the bustling crowd outside. For a moment, neither man spoke, each sizing the other up, the tension palpable. Truman broke the silence first, his voice low but firm. "Dwight, I can't help but feel you've drifted from the values we fought for together." His eyes searched Eisenhower's, seeking recognition, perhaps even remorse. Eisenhower's reply was measured, almost icy. "Harry, the nation has changed. I've had to navigate the realities of politics in ways you wouldn't understand from the Oval Office." He paused, adjusting his gloves. Loyalty and principle are not always enough to govern a country. The exchange, brief as it was, carried the weight of years of camaraderie and growing estrangement. Truman's disappointment hardened into resolve. He would not be a passive observer while his former ally, the man he once had offered the presidency to, charted a course he could not fully endorse. Eisenhower, meanwhile, felt the first pangs of what would become a years-long estrangement, a recognition that the personal bond that had defined their relationship could no longer coexist comfortably with political realities. For the 8 years of Eisenhower's presidency, this confrontation cast a long shadow. Truman was effectively banned from the White House, receiving only curt official invitations and rarely engaging in direct dialogue with his successor. Publicly, both men maintained decorum, their faces composed for cameras and reporters. Privately, however, the bitterness lingered, reinforced by each political maneuver, each policy disagreement, and the unspoken knowledge that the trust they had shared during the war was fractured beyond repair. Yet even amid this estrangement, there were signs of humanity and memory. Both men continued to honor the legacies of those they had served alongside, remembering fallen comrades and the victories of a shared past. But the personal warmth, the candid friendship forged in wartime strategy rooms and airborne operations, remained suspended in a limbo of political caution and mutual suspicion. November 25, 1963. The streets of Washington, D.C. were cloaked in a cold drizzle, the city hushed under the weight of national mourning. President John F. Kennedy had been assassinated just 3 days earlier, and flags flew at half-mast across every government building. The air smelled of damp asphalt and fallen leaves, mingling with the faint scent of incense from the cathedral where the funeral procession would begin. Among the somber dignitaries, 2 men moved with deliberate caution. Harry Truman, aged yet still carrying the aura of his presidency, and Dwight D. Eisenhower, steady and composed, a former general's discipline evident even in grief. For the first time in over a decade, the estranged former president and current former president would stand in close proximity without the strict formalities of a political event. Truman's eyes caught Eisenhower's across the pews, and for a moment, the ghosts of Normandy, Wisconsin, and the bitter 8 years in the White House hung between them. Reporters noticed the tense glances, the measured movements, the subtle hesitation in their handshake, a gesture loaded with history. Inside the cathedral, CBS correspondent Eric Sevareid later recalled the tension. It was clear that both men carried the weight of the past. They had shared battles that shaped the world, yet politics had carved a canyon between them. There was respect, yes, but also a cautious distance that even mourning could not immediately bridge. Eisenhower, as always, maintained his composure, but his jaw was set, a subtle acknowledgment of the personal cost of political ambition. Truman's eyes, more expressive, betrayed a mixture of lingering resentment and the fragile desire for closure. White House usher J.B. West, who had observed their interactions over the years, later described the moment as tentative, almost ceremonial, but it carried the undercurrent of reconciliation. After decades of silence, Truman and Eisenhower spoke quietly, exchanging brief words that hinted at forgiveness without erasing memory. There were no speeches, no public gestures, only a recognition that history had moved on and that personal grievances, while real, were now dwarfed by the enormity of the loss around them. For both men, the funeral was transformative. It offered a lens through which they could view the arc of their shared lives, the intensity of wartime leadership, the exhilaration of victory, and the corrosive effects of political ambition. They were reminded that, despite estrangement, their legacies were intertwined, not just in the pages of history, but in the very structure of American governance, military strategy, and international diplomacy. The moments of quiet dialogue at Kennedy's funeral planted the seeds for a tentative reconciliation. Though neither man publicly acknowledged the decades of tension in full, those who witnessed the interaction sensed a thaw. The bond forged in the crucible of global conflict, though frayed by politics, could still survive the test of time, if only as a private acknowledgment of shared sacrifice and enduring respect. As the casket was lowered and the organ's notes filled the cathedral, Truman and Eisenhower stood apart yet connected by history, the past 8 years of estrangement fading into perspective. In that silence, the nation glimpsed the human cost of political divisions and the possibility that even the deepest rifts could eventually find resolution. In the quiet weeks following Kennedy's funeral, both men retreated into reflection. Harry Truman returned to his modest home in Independence, Missouri, walking the familiar streets with a mixture of nostalgia and regret. The victories of World War II, the trials of the early Cold War, and the bitter estrangement with Eisenhower all weighed on him. He read letters, some unopened for years, and paused over those in which he had expressed confidence in Eisenhower's judgment. In private, Truman admitted to himself that political ambition, both his own and Eisenhower's, had exacted a steep toll on their friendship. Eisenhower, in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, sat in the quiet study of his home, surrounded by military memorabilia and correspondence. For decades he had measured every word, every gesture, aware that as president he was both a man and an institution. The funeral had forced him to confront the personal cost of those years of political calculation. He remembered the Wisconsin speech, the delicate compromises, and the private disappointment in Truman's eyes. Yet he also recognized that leadership demanded difficult choices, and that loyalty sometimes conflicted with duty to the nation. Historians later noted that their estrangement and eventual reconciliation offered profound lessons on the intersection of personal loyalty and political life. Truman's unwavering belief in principle, Eisenhower's careful pragmatism, and the pressures of the McCarthy era and electoral politics created a perfect storm that few friendships could withstand. Yet, their eventual acknowledgement of each other's sacrifices and integrity, quiet, understated, and devoid of ceremony, revealed a resilience in human connection that transcends politics. Memoirs, oral histories, and archival research from the National Archives and presidential libraries confirm these dynamics. J.B. West, reflecting decades later, emphasized that the reconciliation at Kennedy's funeral was not just a social gesture, but an acknowledgement of history itself. These men had lived through extraordinary times together. What they shared could not be erased, even by years of silence or political rivalry. CBS correspondent Eric Sevareid similarly noted the significance. It wasn't a handshake for the cameras. It was a moment where the weight of shared experience finally overcame political differences. In many ways, the Truman-Eisenhower story mirrors the broader challenges of leadership. Decisions made under duress, the balancing of ethics against expediency, and the tension between personal loyalty and public duty are universal themes in governance. Yet this story also carries an intimate human dimension. Two men, bound by history and circumstance, navigating the complex terrain of friendship, ambition, and the passage of time. For students of American politics, Cold War scholars, and history enthusiasts alike, the saga of Truman and Eisenhower provides a cautionary yet inspiring narrative. It reminds us that even those who wield immense power are subject to the fragility of human relationships, and that reconciliation, though delayed, remains possible when respect and shared history endure. By the late 1960s, both Truman and Eisenhower had receded from the daily pulse of American politics, yet their legacies remained deeply intertwined. In public memory, they were often portrayed as pillars of the mid-20th century, the resolute wartime president and the disciplined general-turned-president. But behind the accolades, the story of their fractured friendship offered a richer, more human narrative, a reminder that history is shaped not only by battles and policies, but by personal bonds, misunderstandings, and the consequences of ambition. Eisenhower, reflecting on his presidency in interviews and private letters, acknowledged the burden of political decision-making and the compromises it demanded. He spoke rarely of Truman, but when he did, it was with a quiet respect tinged by regret. The man who had once offered him the presidency, who had championed his rise, had endured years of exclusion from the very White House he once inhabited. Truman, in turn, grew more reflective with age. He often emphasized principle over politics, yet his letters reveal a lingering affection for Eisenhower, recognizing the complexity of leadership and the inevitability of difficult choices. The story of their estrangement and eventual reconciliation at Kennedy's funeral became a touchstone for historians examining the human side of political leadership. It highlighted the tensions inherent in the transition from wartime allies to political actors, the corrosive influence of partisanship, and the personal cost of public service. Scholars from the National Archives and presidential libraries continue to cite their interactions as an illustrative example of the fragile balance between personal loyalty and political responsibility. For the American public, the lessons are enduring. The Truman-Eisenhower feud demonstrates how ambition, loyalty, and principle can clash in ways that shape history as much as military campaigns or legislative victories. It shows that even the closest of allies can become estranged under the pressures of public life, and yet reconciliation remains possible, often in unexpected moments of shared humanity. In the end, their story is not one of complete victory or defeat, but of complexity. It is a testament to the human dimensions behind the grand narratives of power, war, and leadership. The friendship that soared above Normandy, tested in Wisconsin, fractured in Washington, and quietly mended at Kennedy's funeral reminds us that history is as much about the people who lived it as the events they shaped. From the roaring skies over the English Channel to the hushed corridors of the White House, Truman and Eisenhower's journey stands as one of the most compelling examples of how personal loyalty, political ambition, and historical circumstance can intertwine, leaving an indelible mark on the American story.